Today we take a look at these people who were mauled during safari trips. From a tourist who mocked his guide before a leopard attacked, to a photographer who tripped into a crocodile pool just for a photo. But our first, a botanist's obsession with a rare grass would lead him dangerously close to a hunting pride of apex predators. It was March 15th, 2014, and the Serengeti Plains shimmered under a midday sun that offered no mercy. Elias Brandt knelt in golden grass approximately 60 feet from a pride of lions, his field notebook open beside him, entirely focused on a cluster of rare specimens. Elias Brandt was a 29-year-old botanist from New Orleans, Louisiana, known throughout his field for his extensive work cataloging rare African grasses. His colleagues at a university described him as meticulous in his documentation, but dangerously impulsive. Over 6 years, he had published 14 papers on East African flora and had spent cumulative months camping in remote territories across Kenya and Tanzania. His research funding came from a combination of academic grants and private conservation organizations that valued his willingness to venture into areas other botanists avoided. This expedition focused on a grass species rarely documented in predator-dense areas of the Serengeti. Elias had requested access to sections where recent rainfall created ideal growing conditions. His permit allowed only vehicle-based observation with a guide present, and park records show he signed a safety waiver and attended a wildlife encounter briefing. Among colleagues, he was known to bend rules when rare specimens were involved, something that would later prove fatal. The landscape stretched endlessly in waves of gold and green, punctuated by scattered acacia trees casting insufficient shade. A pride of 6 lions lounged roughly 60 feet from where Elias had positioned himself, their bodies relaxed, but their eyes tracking movement across the grassland. African lions are apex predators weighing up to about 420 pounds, capable of reaching speeds of nearly 50 miles per hour in short bursts. Their hunting strategy relies on ambush tactics, with attacks often triggered by prey behavior such as crouching, running, or approaching too close to cubs or resting areas. That morning, Elias's guide, a Tanzanian named Joseph Kimathi, had warned him 3 times about maintaining minimum safe distances. Park regulations required visitors to remain at least 100 feet from any lion pride, a rule Kimathi had emphasized before they left the vehicle. As Elias spotted the grass cluster he sought, he had gestured toward it and began walking, ignoring Kimathi's raised voice. The guide had radioed for backup and followed on foot, physically gesturing for Elias to return to the vehicle. Other tourists in a nearby Land Cruiser had noticed the situation, one lifting binoculars. They said that Elias crouched low, extending his hand toward the grass. One of the lions, a mature male with a partial mane, lifted its head sharply and fixed its gaze on the crouched figure, a posture that can trigger a predatory or defensive response when a human resembles typical prey behavior. Kimathi shouted a final warning and moved closer, now standing between the vehicle and Elias. The other lions remained still, but their attention had shifted. Elias pulled a small specimen bag from his vest pocket, apparently satisfied with his find. He was reaching for a second cluster when the male lion rose to its feet. The attack came without sound. The lion covered the distance in a few explosive bounds, reaching Elias before he could stand. Its jaws clamped onto his left shoulder, canines puncturing through the collarbone with audible cracking. Elias staggered backward, but the lion's weight drove him to the ground. Witnesses reported seeing his legs kick once, before the animal dragged him approximately 5 feet into taller grass. His screams were high-pitched and brief. Kimathi pulled a licensed ranger-issued rifle from the vehicle rack and fired 2 warning shots into the air, the reports echoing across the plains. The lion maintained its grip, locking its jaws into Elias's upper shoulder and pressing down with its full body weight, a restraint technique used by big cats to immobilize prey. The attack lasted between 15 and 20 seconds, with the lion's teeth tearing through Elias's upper torso. His right arm flailed briefly before going limp. The remaining pride members watched, but did not approach. Kimathi fired a 3rd shot directly over the attacking lion, which finally released its grip and retreated 10 feet. Elias lay motionless in crushed grass, his shoulder torn open, exposing bone and severed muscle. Kimathi radioed the park ranger station immediately. The rough terrain required 15 minutes for the emergency vehicle to arrive. Elias was unconscious and unresponsive when rangers reached him. They administered basic first aid and applied pressure bandages to his shoulder and neck wounds, while attempting to slow heavy bleeding that could not be fully controlled in the field before transporting him to the vehicle. An emergency helicopter evacuation was requested, arriving 40 minutes after the initial call after dispatch clearance and flight time from the regional ranger airstrip. Elias was airlifted to a medical clinic in Arusha, arriving approximately approximately 90 minutes after the attack. However, medical staff pronounced him dead upon arrival. The wildlife authorities conducted a standard investigation, concluding that Elias had violated multiple safety protocols by approaching an active lion pride on foot. His field notebook and collected botanical samples were returned to Tulane University. Yet even as Elias's field notebook lay blood-stained in the Serengeti dust, a tourist in Kruger was mocking his guide's desperate warnings about the leopard watching from the low branch above. It was July 21st, 2015. The South African sun still low over Kruger National Park, casting long shadows across the savannah as the morning game drive came to a sudden halt. The guide cut the engine near a cluster of marula trees, where a leopard lay draped across a low branch, its spotted coat dappled by filtered light. Colin Mercer was a 40-year-old IT systems analyst from Bath, England, known among colleagues for his contrarian streak and tendency to challenge workplace protocols he deemed unnecessary. His friends described him as confident to the point of abrasive, the type who dismissed safety briefings as theater designed for less experienced travelers. Colin had arrived at Kruger 3 days earlier on a solo trip, having saved for 2 years to afford what he called his African adventure. This safari was Colin's 5th game drive that week, and he had grown increasingly dismissive of his guide's instructions. He had openly mocked the warnings about maintaining distance from predators, joking that the guides were overly cautious to avoid lawsuits. That morning, he had brought his expensive digital camera specifically to capture what friends said he described as real wildlife photography, not the distant shots other tourists settled for. The dirt road cut through dry grassland dotted with acacia and scattered bush. Perfect camouflage for the ambush predators that ruled this territory. Leopards are among Africa's most dangerous big cats despite their smaller size compared to lions, weighing up to 200 pounds and possessing the strongest bite force relative to body size of any feline. They are primarily solitary and intensely territorial, capable of dragging prey twice their weight into trees to protect kills from scavengers. Unlike lions that hunt cooperatively in open spaces, leopards rely on stealth and explosive power, attacking from concealment with precision strikes to the neck or spine. The guide, Kiwe, had spotted the leopard about 65 feet from the road and positioned the vehicle safely, warning everyone to remain seated and silent. Colin immediately began unbuckling his seatbelt, dismissing the rules as paranoid. During a brief distraction, he stepped out, walking 15 feet toward the leopard as Kiwe shouted and tried to stop him. Colin jogged another 20 feet, laughing and raising his camera, ignoring the leopard's warning signals. Colin had now closed the distance to roughly 20 to 25 feet from the tree when he crouched slightly to adjust his angle. The leopard launched from the branch, covering the gap in 3 bounding leaps that took less than 2 seconds. Witnesses in the vehicle later reported seeing a blur of spotted fur before Colin disappeared into the tall grass beside the road. He fell forward under the impact, the leopard's full weight, approximately 180 pounds, slamming into his upper back and driving him face first into the dirt. The cat's jaws clamped onto the back of Colin's neck with surgical precision, its teeth driving deep into muscle and connective tissue near the cervical spine. Colin's scream cut off abruptly as pressure on his spinal cord sent waves of numbness radiating through his shoulders and arms. The leopard's rear claws raked his back repeatedly, shredding his shirt and opening long gashes across his shoulder blades. Kiwe reached them within 10 seconds, swinging the metal pole and blaring the vehicle horn again while shouting in an effort to distract the animal and drive it off without closing the distance further. The leopard maintained its grip, its jaws clamped with crushing force on the back of Colin's neck. The sounds, Colin's gurgling attempts to breathe, the wet tearing of flesh, the leopard's low growl, carried clearly to the horrified tourists in the vehicle. One passenger began radioing for emergency assistance. After approximately 25 seconds of sustained attack, a second Ranger vehicle arrived, its driver honking the horn repeatedly and accelerating toward the scene. The leopard finally released Colin and retreated into the brush, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Colin lay motionless except for shallow, irregular breathing. His neck was a mass of puncture wounds and torn tissue, blood pooling around his head. The Rangers wrapped Colin's neck as best they could and loaded him into the vehicle. Paramedics were contacted immediately, and once a nearby clearing along the road was confirmed safe for landing, a medical helicopter airlifted him to a trauma center in Nelspruit within the hour. Surgeons worked for 6 hours to stabilize the vertebral fracture and repair damaged blood vessels. Despite the initial efforts, his condition deteriorated overnight due to extensive spinal cord damage and internal bleeding that could not be fully controlled. Colin Mercer died early the following morning, A short notice appeared weeks later in a regional park safety bulletin stating that a tourist had died after exiting his vehicle against explicit instructions during a predator sighting. Kiwe, who had guided safaris for 17 years without incident, resigned 3 months later and focused on a personal business, as the leopard's bite left a tourist dead in a hospital bed. Just 14 months later, in the shimmering channels of the Okavango Delta, a corporate lawyer's distraction during a business call would cost him everything. It was September 12, 2016, and the Okavango Delta stretched endlessly under the late afternoon sun, its waters deceptively calm as Marco Duval's boat drifted through a narrow channel scattered with water lilies and half-submerged hippos. Marco Duval, 38, was the attorney who never truly left the office even when his body occupied exotic locations. His colleagues joked that Marco could negotiate a settlement from anywhere, and he had, from Bali, from Patagonia, from safaris like this one. His wife Elena had begged him to leave work behind for this trip, their 10th anniversary present to themselves. But 3 days into the Delta tour, his phone had buzzed with what his senior partner called a crisis. Marco promised Elena it would be quick, just one call to smooth things over. The trip to Botswana had been Elena's idea, a chance to reconnect away from Chicago's relentless pace. Marco had agreed, booking an upscale safari package that promised authentic wilderness encounters. He'd purchased an expensive camera setup specifically for wildlife photography, excited about capturing images of elephants and big cats. But old habits proved difficult to break, and when his phone found signal that afternoon at the lodge, Marco couldn't resist checking email. The delta shimmered with golden light, its surface broken by the rounded backs of hippopotamuses scattered throughout the channel. These massive animals are among Africa's most dangerous, responsible for more human deaths than lions or crocodiles. Adult hippos can weigh up to 4,000 pounds, and despite their bulk, can move with shocking speed both in water and on land. Territorial by nature, they become particularly aggressive when they perceive threats to their space, attacking boats that drift too close with little warning. Their guide, Lesigo, had warned them to stay seated, keep hands inside the boat, and remain quiet, explaining that hippos react to noise and sudden movements. As Marco argued on the phone and leaned over the gunwale to photograph a hippo, Lesigo tried to move the boat back and physically pull him down. A loud snort erupted, and a second hippo surfaced just 15 feet away, opening its jaws and blowing sharply, a clear warning. The guide shouted for Marco to sit down, his voice sharp with alarm. Other tourists in boats further down the channel looked up at the commotion. Elena yanked harder on Marco's arm, but he jerked away from her grip, annoyed at the interruption. The boat drifted slightly with the current, closing the distance to the agitated hippo by another yard. Through the clear water, Lesigo could see the animal's massive body tense, its legs pushing against the muddy bottom as it began to rise. The hippo lunged without further warning, exploding from the water with a speed that defied its enormous bulk. Marco, still half standing and turned away, registered movement too late. The animal surged forward and snapped its jaws toward him as it struck the side of the Mokoro, the force knocking him sideways out of the boat. He hit the knee-deep water over the sandbar hard, his back and ribs slamming against submerged tree branches that jutted from the channel floor. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Before Marco could orient himself or attempt to stand in the shallow water, the hippo was on him. Its massive jaws opened wide and clamped down on his torso, the tusks punching through flesh and grating against bone. Marco's scream was cut short as the hippo began to thrash its head violently, crushing his ribcage with grinding pressure. Elena's shrieks mixed with Lesigo's shouts as the guide frantically grabbed a signal flare from the emergency kit. The hippo released Marco momentarily before lunging forward again in another violent burst, biting down across his side and dragging him through the muddy shallows. Marco's arms flailed weakly as water churned red around him. Each time he surfaced gasping, the hippo attacked again in short, violent surges, biting and crushing. Lesigo fired the flare directly at the hippo's face while shouting and striking the water with his paddle. Another guide from a boat 30 yards away paddled desperately closer, adding his voice to the noise. The combined disturbance finally caused the hippo to retreat after several separate charges over roughly a minute. It submerged and moved away into deeper water, leaving Marco floating face down, barely conscious and critically injured in the bloodied shallows. Lesigo and the second guide hauled Marco's limp body into the boat with Elena's help. His torso showed massive trauma, ribs visibly crushed, deep puncture wounds from tusks, and severe tissue damage from the repeated bites. He was semi-conscious, struggling to breathe, blood bubbling from his mouth with each shallow attempt. The guides began emergency evacuation immediately, paddling hard toward the nearest camp with radio access. It took 20 minutes to reach the lodge where an emergency medical team waited. Marco died during the boat journey, succumbing to massive internal hemorrhaging and organ damage from crushed ribs that had punctured both lungs and his liver. Local authorities thoroughly documented the incident, filing detailed reports on the circumstances leading to Marco's death, and interviewing all guides and expedition participants. Elena returned to Chicago carrying the weight of her husband's body and the shock of the day's events. Okavango tour operators quietly circulated new safety protocols in the wake of the hippo attack. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, a photographer would slip away into the dawn fog, his camera trained on a bull elephant. It was May 6, 2017, and the pre-dawn darkness of Tarangire National Park held secrets that would claim a life before sunrise. The mist-shrouded savanna concealed more than just landscape. It masked the presence of a territorial bull elephant. Adrian Fossey was a 40-year-old freelance travel photographer from Brussels, known among his peers for producing striking wildlife images that magazines paid premium rates to publish. His portfolio featured dangerously intimate shots of lions, rhinos, and elephants, photographs that suggested either remarkable luck or reckless proximity. Adrian's colleagues understood it was the latter. He had built his reputation on what he called authentic close-up photography, a practice that required abandoning the safety protocols most wildlife photographers followed. His previous trips to Kenya, South Africa, and Botswana had all involved incidents where guides reprimanded him for wandering from groups or approaching animals beyond safe distances. Yet each time, Adrian had emerged unharmed, his camera full of stunning images that likely validated his methods in his own mind. This trip to Tarangire was specifically planned for elephant photography during the dry season when herds congregated near remaining water sources. Adrian had booked a guided walking safari with a mid-tier safari company that offered dawn excursions, though he likely had no intention of staying with the group. What Adrian either dismissed or failed to understand was the fundamental nature of African elephants, particularly solitary bulls during must periods. Adult male elephants can weigh up to 13,000 pounds and stand 13 feet tall at the shoulder. Their tusks, which can reach 8 feet in length and weigh over 80 pounds each, are modified incisors capable of impaling predators or gouging tree trunks. Bulls in must periods of heightened testosterone become highly aggressive and territorial, reacting quickly to movement or scent. Their intelligence and memory make them especially dangerous, as they remember places and situations where humans threaten them. The morning safari group had assembled at 5:30 a.m., 12 tourists and 2 guides preparing to photograph the sunrise over the park. The lead guide, a Tanzanian man named Joseph, had specifically warned the group about elephant activity in the area. A large bull had been spotted near the camp for 3 consecutive mornings, displaying agitated behavior. Joseph instructed everyone to remain within sight of the guides at all times. 20 minutes into the excursion, as other photographers focused on a family of giraffes backlit by the rising sun, Adrian slipped away from the group. He likely followed the tracks into the mist, his camera ready, moving deeper into an area where visibility dropped to roughly 50 feet. The grass, slicked with heavy dew, muffled his footsteps. Distant elephant calls echoed through the fog, low-frequency rumbles that elephants use to communicate across miles of savanna. Joseph noticed Adrian's absence within 5 minutes and sounded the vehicle's horn 3 times, the agreed-upon signal for regrouping. Adrian must have heard it, but was probably focused on what appeared to be a massive shape materializing through the mist ahead. The bull elephant stood less than 30 feet away, its head raised, ears extended. The elephant had not only noticed, but had likely been tracking Adrian's approach for several minutes through a combination of smell, hearing, and subtle movement through the grass. The bull's ears suddenly flared outward, extending its apparent size from 13 feet to nearly 20 feet across, a clear threat display Adrian either didn't recognize or thought he could capture before retreating. The charge came without further hesitation. The elephant closed the distance in little more than a second, its massive bulk moving with shocking speed through the wet grass. Adrian turned to run, but managed only 2 steps before roughly 13,000 pounds of muscle and rage made contact. The bull's right tusk caught Adrian in the lower back, the force of impact lifting him completely off the ground before the tusk penetrated his torso, piercing through his lumbar region and into his abdominal cavity. Adrian's body was driven forward and downward as the elephant's momentum carried the charge through. He hit the ground face first with the elephant's forehead, following immediately behind, crushing his ribcage against the earth. Multiple ribs snapped on both sides. Bone fragments punctured both lungs. The elephant raised its front right foot and brought it down onto Adrian's midsection with enough force to rupture his liver and spleen. The entire attack lasted approximately 30 seconds from initial contact to the elephant's retreat. 2 tourists from the main group, alerted by Joseph's shouts, witnessed his final seconds from a distance. They described seeing the elephant toss something that they initially thought was a large bag before realizing it was a human body. Joseph radioed for emergency assistance, while another guide drove toward the attack site, using the vehicle's engine noise to ensure the bull had fully withdrawn. They found Adrian unconscious and unresponsive, his body positioned partially under thorn bushes roughly 80 feet from where the initial charge had occurred. Joseph and the second guide loaded Adrian into the vehicle and began driving toward the park's airstrip, while continuing to radio for medical evacuation. Paramedics pronounced Adrian dead upon examination. He had likely died within 2 to 3 minutes of the attack from massive internal bleeding and trauma. Adrian's family arranged for his remains to be returned to Belgium, where he was buried in a private ceremony. The safari company implemented stricter protocols, requiring guests to sign detailed waivers and remain within arm's reach of guides during walking portions of excursions. The elephant remained in Tarangire, where it continues to be monitored by wildlife researchers studying musk behavior patterns. However, even as Tanzania forgets the trampled photographer, another photo-hungry man was steadying his lens toward the murky water, unaware of the ancient predator drifting just beneath the surface. It was October 3rd, 2018, the late afternoon sun hanging low over the Lower Zambezi National Park in Zambia, casting amber light across the muddy riverbanks, where the water moved slow and dark. Derek Lindell, a 35-year-old amateur wildlife photographer from Minneapolis, crouched near the water's edge. His camera lens focused on the pattern of ripples where the current met the shore. Derek worked as an IT consultant but lived for his photography trips. His apartment walls were covered with framed prints from previous expeditions to Costa Rica, Kenya, and Thailand. Colleagues described him as meticulous in his work, but impulsive when traveling, often venturing closer to wildlife than guides recommended. He had arrived in Zambia 5 days earlier with a small photography tour group on a specialized photography expedition along the riverbank, spending each day along the Zambezi's banks, trying to capture the perfect shot of the river ecosystem at golden hour. His reputation within the tour group had already raised concerns. On 2 previous outings, guides had warned him about standing too close to the water's edge. They said that Derek's method involved positioning himself as near to his subjects as possible, believing proximity created intimacy in his photographs. He had dismissed crocodile warnings, noting that he had seen none during their walks. A Zambian guide named Bello had specifically told the group that morning about recent crocodile activity along their planned route. The riverbank where Derek positioned himself that afternoon was deceptively treacherous. The mud sloped gradually toward the water, becoming increasingly unstable near the edge where crocodiles preferred to wait. Nile crocodiles are among Africa's most dangerous predators, capable of growing over 16 feet long and weighing more than 1,600 pounds. They can remain motionless in murky water for hours, with only their eyes and nostrils breaking the surface, before exploding forward in a short burst that can cover several feet in less than a second. Their bite force measures more than 3,500 pounds per square inch, among the most powerful recorded in the animal kingdom, and their hunting technique relies on the death roll, a spinning maneuver that tears flesh and breaks bones while disorienting prey. The group had arrived at the location around 5:15 p.m. Bello positioned the tourists on a raised area about 35 feet from the water, pointing out safe vantage points. Derek nodded, but gradually moved closer, drawn by the light reflecting off the water's surface. Exposed tree roots created natural obstacles along the slope, and the mud bore the slick sheen of recent rain. Bello called out twice for Derek to step back, but the photographer waved him off, adjusting his telephoto lens. The guides were supervising but allowed limited solo positioning because of Derek's previous photography experience. At approximately 5:45 p.m., Derek shifted his weight, likely to get a better angle. His right foot caught on a thick root protruding from the mud. He stumbled forward, arms windmilling as he tried to regain balance. His left foot plunged into the shallow water at the river's edge, sinking into soft sediment. For perhaps 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the water exploded. The crocodile lunged from its position just below the surface, its massive jaws clamping around Derek's calf with audible force. The initial bite crushed through muscle and scraped bone, the conical teeth locking into flesh. Derek screamed, a raw sound of shock and pain, as he fell backward onto the muddy slope. The crocodile began its death roll immediately, thrashing and spinning in the shallow water, rolling as far as it could in the mud and water, while grinding Derek's leg against exposed roots and sediment. After Derek's fall prevented it from dragging him straight into deeper water, Derek's leg twisted unnaturally, the knee joint rotating past its normal range. The crocodile completed a violent rotation, then struggled to roll further, each movement crushing the shattered bones against each other. Derek clawed at the mud, trying desperately to pull himself up the bank, but the slippery surface offered no purchase. Belo and another guide rushed down the slope. The other guide grabbed a thick branch and jabbed it hard at the crocodile's snout, while Belo seized Derek under the arms. The crocodile released momentarily as the branch strike disrupted its grip. In that 3-second window, they dragged Derek slightly toward deeper water. But the crocodile lunged again, re-gripping Derek's already mangled leg just above the ankle. The second round of rolling was worse. The crocodile thrashed side to side, its tail creating waves in the shallow water. Derek's tibia fractured completely. The attack lasted approximately 90 seconds in total before the crocodile finally retreated into deeper water. A park ranger stationed a quarter-mile away heard the commotion and arrived in a vehicle after roughly 6 minutes due to the terrain. By the time they reached him, Derek was unresponsive, his body showing catastrophic trauma from the bite and death rolls. Attempts at resuscitation failed. Derek Lindell was pronounced dead at the scene, having suffered massive crush injuries, severed tendons, and exsanguination from the attack. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.